Well, good morning. This morning I wanted to talk about staying motivated. It was a funny experience. As soon as I started scripting my podcast, viewership dropped. Again, I can't be sure if it's some of the words I use. I mean, I do not censor myself whatsoever, so I'll use all of the verboten words. But, so I was really beginning to feel incredibly discouraged. And so I did a Yi Ching reading yesterday. Just, I had nothing else. Really, I had lost a lot of hope in whether this protocol and everything that I've been working out, whether my survival guide or whether my story would become a survival guide. Right? I was beginning to doubt. And I was telling myself yesterday, you can't be like that, right? Because all great transformative insights are written for future generations. They're not written for your compatriots, your current fellows. But I was still really discouraged. And so what I did is I picked up this book. It's very uniquely Canadian, very uniquely even to the area I'm in. I had no idea. I just picked it up because it looked interesting. It's a book by a young man named Michael Jacques, Michel Jacques, but no, he's not French. He learned some French from his grandparents, but he lives around near me. And long story short, he's learning disabled like me. He has some sort of atypical issues. I don't know how to say this. He couldn't read, he couldn't write, but he actually wrote a book. It took him 5 years, like me, which is funny. I've been doing my podcast for 5 years. Did the exact same thing. It's just just speaking into his iPad. And he was doing voice to text. I'm doing voice to voice because, again, I didn't have someone else to edit and go over. So if I did voice to text, it wouldn't help me much considering I wasn't a reader. Now, I passed the literacy test, and the only reason why I now know was because everyone else was worse than me. But I think their problem is they were either lazy or what have you, whereas for me, just to, pass as a reader, as a writer, as someone who was literate, it took an incredible amount of strength, incredible amount of effort. In fact, I've said this before. As a severe dyslexic, reading a physical book, I thought was, the height of pain. Incredibly painful for reading is what I mean. But then I found ebooks so much worse, especially on some of those early devices. Like for me on a little iPad, I just could not be reading a book. But what I've learned, just to give you some insight, by developing my protocol for overcoming learning disability, using audiobooks, for example, and picturing the words being written on a whiteboard or a chalkboard, depending on what your age or your reference was, right? I used to do the whiteboard because I found it was, even in my brain, I found the writing flowed smoother than it did on a chalkboard. It's funny how the brain works like that, right? That's linguistic relativity in reverse, right? So, it is language, but it's visual that I'm thinking. But because in reality, a chalkboard has much more resistance to the chalk, or vice versa, however the physics of that works, versus, say, a nice little grease marker on a whiteboard. That stuff just, it squeaks, but it flows a lot more easy. Right? So by developing this protocol, what I found out is it didn't just make me better at staying focused. That's originally what I thought it would do. Stay focused while you're listening to an audiobook. That's what I hear a lot of people say. I have a hard time staying focused listening to an audiobook. Well, you need to find a way to stay focused. It's the same as when we first started learning how to read books. I hear all the time people tell me who may actually be undiagnosed dyslexic that they'll read a paragraph or a page and they'll stop and they don't know what they'd read. So they have to go back and read over and over again. That's what I used to have to do. That was my struggle. But for me, I could never get that information to register. I was maybe literate, to a certain degree, but not fluent. So not properly literate enough to become a full human being. And I don't mean that specifically in the idea of reading and writing makes you a full human being. But what I'm getting at here is the skills that reading and writing develops in us are the skills that we need in our brain. It helps us to think. It helps us to cognize things. It's critical thinking. It's what they used to test in IQ tests, right? Like, are you able to manipulate objects in your mind? Well, spinning a cube in your mind is one thing, but imagine spinning a thought that is already mind-bending. Like some of these really crazy ideas that you might run into in literature and art, science and philosophy and psychology, they can really put the zap on your head. And without practice, this becomes impossible. And that was me initially, like I hear other people. I absolutely could not read. I would read the same line, the same paragraph. Sometimes I could get past the line, but I could read the same paragraph over and over and over again. And by the time I finished, I had no idea what I'd read. But what I didn't realize is I was just repeating the same behavior over and over again and expecting different results. So what I found out was, and here's what's funny, I realized this morning, I used to go around lying, not like Jonathan McWhorter, lying about what books I had read. I used to lie about having read physical books because I didn't want people to know how illiterate I was. But also there was this belief that an audiobook wasn't like actually reading the book. For some reason, people have this idea that it's not the same. And the reason why, I think, it's because most people can't stay focused, as I said. They don't use the protocol, like I said earlier, of imagining the words being written, or at least imagining the ideas and engaging with them. It's so easy to allow the mind to wander listening to an audiobook as compared to reading a physical book. So what I found was by embracing my limitations, not ignoring them, embracing my limitations and doubling down and see, this is how I've evolved. I used to think this was all a bunch of silly talk by these ableist type people, or whatever the term is, right? People who are supporting or trying to support. And I've come to realize that, yes, well, this is how it works. So because I couldn't read at all, therefore I couldn't write at all. In fact, there was this one gentleman I met in, while giving tours in the Buddhist temple. I actually trained him how to do tours. He was there prior to me, but again, you know, when I came in, I changed up the whole place. And remember, I'd learned all about Buddhism with audiobooks and seminars, and I did very little reading. I did do some reading. But again, what a book that would take the average person a couple weeks or a month to read, I might take years. So that's why it took me so many years. But this gentleman who I had impressed, and he was enamored with my understanding of philosophy and Buddhism and life, literature and everything. He said he was envious of my memory, that I could remember all of this stuff. But when we started conversing outside of the temple, one of the first emails I sent him, he actually responded with, wow, I mean, I can't understand what you're saying. He actually thought it was like, I can't remember exactly his verbiage. I'd have to go back. I have the email. But essentially insinuating like it was like a grade 5 kid or something, or worse, had composed the email. And so that's when I didn't really realize what I was saying, but that's when I just admitted, yes, well, I'm severely dyslexic. I can't write. I'm very verbal. And it was a shock for him. And it was a shock for me to realize how bad I was. In fact, just to give an example, I was trying to heal a friend of the family, and they just kept getting my instructions wrong over and over again. And never mind that they knew who I was. And even my own mother didn't realize, because I actually had to say, name a time when you've ever seen me write something. And it just went completely silent. But what I did for this friend of the family is I composed an email. It wasn't a lot, but it took me a couple of days. I composed an email explaining the protocol of trying to heal inflammation through the way I had been doing it at the time. And then once again, I didn't even get a thanks. That bothered me a little bit because of how much effort, because I tried to explain what an ask that was. And so when they went and got mad at me again because they didn't follow the instructions, I just lost it. And I'm like, do you realize what I've been trying to do to help you here? See, it was my defensiveness. I didn't want to admit. Later, I did and said, you have no idea what an effort it was for me to try to type out that email. But trust me, this is not a sad story, because what ended up happening is I listened to a controversial figure online. He said, do something for a year. So at this point, this was a little over 2 years ago. At this point, I had gotten to a plateau of healing. I had solved a number of the problems, but I was still stuck. I had been listening to audiobooks for a while, and I'd actually developed quite a system where I was listening to them and I thought I was pretty chuffed, at 1.2 times speed and sometimes 1.5. Because when I looked up the data, Audible said that very few people are engaging with these audiobooks at an increased rate of speed. I think they said a fraction of a percent. So I was chuffed. I'm like, hey, I'm doing good here. But what I found out is I completely doubled down on this daily thing. I actually I was sponsored. It's just beautiful. I was given a membership by a wonderful human being, membership to Audible. And I set up a couple of, library cards, right? My wife, myself, and between a couple of libraries, luckily, set up a couple of apps, right? I was able to use the Hoopla app, the Libby app, Overdrive, and even Audible. And I was using LibriVox for years before this. That's where I really cut my teeth on audiobooks. Plus, don't turn me in there. I was using torrents there for a while, because at least here in Canada, most of the books I was reading up until I got Audible and Libby, almost all of them fell in the open copyright for Canada, right? And then that changed, but I'm dating myself there. But neither here nor there. What I'm getting at is I'd actually progressed to a certain degree by listening to audiobooks and by learning that way, but I hadn't progressed my learning. I wasn't able to read, right? Like I said, I struggled intensely with trying to heal this particular disease because my doctor had pretty much given up. I've given you every pill there is. This is what I realized. Like, he said he's tried everything. He did recommend I take up exercise, but he didn't explain anything beyond that. It didn't explain anything about diet or anything at all. Right? Especially it was hard because him recommending exercise at the time, the disease I had actually would have made it nearly impossible, because the disease would have got worse and I had almost no mobility. I mean, I would have been bleeding all over the machines to boot. I'm not exaggerating. But I took on that agency when he gave up, and it wasn't pills, obviously. It was a natural way of healing. So I took on healing inflammation, but that meant I had to start learning how to read. And I had to start learning how to read, of all things, PubMed articles, right? Research articles. But what I didn't realize was, instead of reading what I see a lot of adult booktubers do, and reading young adult fiction, what I was doing was, instead of challenging myself a little bit, like I recommend people to read The Little Prince or Le Petit Prince. You can read it in English and French. I recommend listening to it in French if you're learning French, following along in English so you can pick up things, yada, yada, yada. I used it to practice up with my French. But what I didn't realize is, by challenging myself, right, with the French, learning how to listen to it and translate in real time for my wife, practicing that, but more so was when I was forcing myself to read PubMed articles and not C-Spot Ron or Dr. Seuss. By reading Buddhist sutras for all those years, what I'd actually done is I hadn't seen the progress as a human being. We don't see incremental progress, but I actually had progressed to a point where I was beginning to be able to read pretty well. I couldn't read terribly fast. But I think this is the problem, right? Because Marianne Wolfe, one of the leading researchers of reading, says that we skim over stuff too much. So I think, again, because of my dyslexia, I was forced to focus, pay attention, take my time, and really read. And so after a couple of years of reading PubMed and needing to interact a little bit on social media, which I was using as an experiment, I would take posts or comments and I would riff off of that and I would write out a comment, learning how to write. I used to use the Hemingway editor online. And here's a funny story. When I first started this journey, only a few years ago, I was pretty chuffed because when I uploaded one of my first, when I uploaded one of the first pieces of my writing to Hemingway's editor, I'm not saying the first things I wrote, but after a number of years of practicing how to write, because again, I told you, I got through high school because they knew I was, they found out late that I had a learning disability and I was put in French immersion. And at that time, they thought that's what made me worse, but actually, what allowed me to make it till grade 10 before they even noticed I had this severe learning disability. So they felt bad. So what they did is they just essentially passed me. I told you about this English teacher of mine who said I wrote with a unique voice. That was her way of saying that you had to be an English literature professor to understand what I was trying to say. And so that's what happened to me with the Hemingway editor. I uploaded a piece of my writing that I was pretty chuffed at. I thought it was good. It was a lot better than what I used to write. And it came out at like grade 17. Something ridiculous like that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, my writing is so good. It thinks, no, that means you have to have like 17 years of education to understand what I was talking about, right? It's like E.E. Cummings on acid, right? No punctuation properly, at least. Everything was dashes and dots, overuse of commas in the wrong way. My grammar was just absolutely atrocious. But never mind these crazy, weird ideas. Imagine someone who was a Fringlish, Anglaise, raised, trying to make sense. But anyways, Hemingway editor made me realize, no, I'm sorry. Your writing is so tough that it would take, like I said, an English professor to read what you actually mean. And after a number of years of really working hard at trying to be able to express my ideas, and at this time it was very long-winded, but I got to the point where, and I've just seen it, I tested it, this is a couple years later, I tested some of my writing recently and it still came out without any adjusting, and I still play fast and loose with grammar and punctuation and format and stuff, but it still gave me around a grade 5. Right? And with editing, I could get it down to like a grade 3. So I was super chuffed. I was doing really good over the last few years. I've gotten really good at, even though the podcast wouldn't tell, I got very good at simplifying ideas, trying to say things in as few words as possible, in writing at least. And you can understand why. I'm very verbose, but in writing's difficult, so I wanted to make it as simple as possible. So I've succeeded at that. I had succeeded at that, but I wanted to get better. And so by accident, like I said, I took on this challenge put forth by a controversial online figure to do something for a year. And so at that point, I'd become pretty proficient with the audiobooks. I was listening to them on my walks. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to challenge myself to do something. So I said, I'm going to listen to an audiobook every single day. Now, not, a new book every day. Like, for example, what did I just finish reading? Well, The Plague by Camus. But what's another one? Ian McGilchrist's book, Master and His Emissary. I mean, that one's a huge book, right? Or even Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. That one's what? Huge. Or Charles Taylor's book on A Secular World, How Not to Be, or at least, no, sorry, that's a different book. But Charles Taylor's book is, 54 hours long. Right, so, yeah, I mean, your average book being 4 hours long, that's essentially reading 12 or 13 books, right? So I didn't pick books based on size. I didn't get any, like a lot of people I see will just pick nice, simple books so they can say, see, done. No, I picked them based on what I loved. And here's what happened. So before I started that 1 year, which we've hit, it's over 2 years. The end of September was 2 years And it was also, I think, the 5th. We're now in the 6th year of this podcast. Right? So what ended up happening is before I started this read a book a day challenge, I would read books. I read a lot of books compared to most people. When 90% of people only read half a book a year, it's a low bar. But yeah, I could read a book, 2, sometimes 3, maybe even 4 books a month, thanks to audiobooks. Now I read physical books now, and it's good, but I'm still much prefer audiobooks and here's why. After a year of listening to an audiobook a day, and you think things wouldn't change all that much. Now I can read physical books better, ebooks much better. My writing's improved, my thought process is improved, my critical thinking, my problem solving, my analytical skills have all improved. Surprising, because I was in the top 1 or 2 percentile, top 1 percentile for analytical. But here's the surprise. Is I not only succeeded in reading a book a day, some days I was reading 2 and 3 books, those shorter books, because at Ian McGilchrist, a book that at one time would have taken me, even as an audiobook, would have taken me weeks to listen to, I can get through in 2, 3, 4 days. But you know what's funny is I listened to Mortimer Alder when another book that I listened to, How to Read. He says, if you've only read a book once, you haven't read it. So remember, McGilchrist's book, I probably spent, I think I remember the number, it was about 6 days I spent with that book. But I listened to it twice. And again, if I had that physical book in front of me, it would have taken me months to read once, and I wouldn't have picked any of it up. But after 2 years of this experiment of reading a book a day, I can say with certainty that all of my crazy theories about teaching kids with audiobooks even now that I've learned about linguistic coding, Pavio, his theory of dual coding, applies here. The stuff we've learned about kids learning on iPads versus physically with pencils, and it all applies here. So what I've understood is we need to double down on the audiobooks. It's not a shortcut. In fact, arguably, I think, as Marianne Wolf said, since we're born listeners, storytellers, then why do we stop listening and telling stories when we're young? Maybe that's the reason why podcasts have exploded in recent years, because we're story beasts. I argue it also goes to the point that we're all struggling to find ourselves, our identity, and who we are. And the big part of that is our myth, our mythos, the stories that we tell. But I don't know, I digress. But what I've found is almost everything has become error. The example I'll give you is when I was years ago, when I was beginning to develop my own healing protocol, I shared it with family members. And when I found out how one of my family members' diabetes was being treated and what the Canadian Diabetes Association tells, I was shocked. And I'm like, what? That is not what you want to do. And I told my mother to get on this and take this and stop eating this, and this is what you should do. And I mean, I even explained how Alzheimer's is a type 3 diabetes, but I watched as my own mother began to deteriorate cognitively. And I said that I thought it was because of how they're treating her diabetes. It's absolutely tragic, but I became the villain because, well, they listened to their doctors and they ignored me, even though fast forward 5 to 10 years, I was right on almost everything. And if anyone's still listening, I don't think it's much of a risk to tell you this. Imagine my experience. I'm one of those people that is so highly allergic to things, I never got my inoculations. I almost got kicked out of school a couple of times because I didn't have them because of blind administrators. But here's the funny thing. I am incredibly healthy. I almost get almost nothing besides what I do believe is either caused by the trauma that I received as a kid, the traumatic brain injury, or growing up, where and with who I grew up with, or even having been raised initially on top of a uranium mine, playing in the dirt. But when it comes to overall other health, compared to all my other friends who are constantly sick, I was comparatively very healthy. But imagine when I had just spent years showing my doctor that I had healed a number of what they thought incurable diseases. In fact, I told you this, the one disease I have, I actually share likely with Karl Marx. And when I first was fighting with it, my doctor just had no idea. He said, I don't know, pretty much gave up, right? But believe it or not, this is actually what ended up happening, is I ended up getting such a horrible abscess that I had to go to emergency to get it drained. And in emergency, because of the physical pain I was in, joints, the one doctor took such great compassion, because again, I had a softball size abscess in my hip, but that didn't bother me. And her poking me and all that, none of that made me, and you could tell, I'm sure, as a doctor, right? None of that bothered me. But me just trying to get my leg up on the exam table, I guess she could see the pain I was in. And so she gave me a consult. I even had to get x-rays because the pain was so severe in my joints that they thought I had joint problems, joint issues, something was wrong, just inflammation. But I got a consult with the dermatologist. First time, it's Canadian, you've probably heard this stuff. The wait time, I called. The wait time was years. I'm not exaggerating, years to get in to see a dermatologist here in Canada. And this is before COVID. Well, there you go. I just got censored again. But what ended up happening is the dermatologist, he said it so quick, I couldn't understand what he said. The first doctor was a lovely lady, very nice, excellent bedside manner. The next doctor was an import, excellent English, excellent bedside manner, but for some reason he seemed very unsure. And the dermatologist, I don't know what the story is there. He's very well known in the area, but his English was terrible. He didn't look, his bedside manner was terrible. He was awful, just awful. But eventually after, I don't know how long, a couple of days of Googling different diseases of what I thought I remembered they'd said, because again, this is Canada, so they told me nothing. They gave me nothing. They just poked and prodded just to see, what all this was. But it ends up, it's a horrible inflammatory disease which causes these abscesses, but also causes joint muscle pain. Incredible. In fact, dermatologists say it's one of the worst diseases you can have as far as in their field, their siloed institution. But imagine how I feel today to find out that I was right all along. Right about that I shouldn't have gotten any of these recent pokes that actually, no conspiracy involved here, when I first looked it up, again, worried about what they said was coming, because again, our chronic illness, I was afraid what would happen if we caught some horrible, right? Because I can go into the whole, cytokine storm thing, right? And I found out right away, and they took away these warnings, but I found out right away, and this is going back to 2020 or something, found out right away there was a black box warning for people with an inflammatory condition. Oof. Never mind, there is a guidance from, nothing good out of Canada, but there was a guidance from the College of, Immunologists and Allergists in America. And it said you should get a consult with your immunologist about whether to get it. And you won't believe what my doctor said. He wouldn't look up from his papers, because I'm sure he knew he had to say this. But he told me that, they'll answer, right? You should get it. And I said, but what about what I just told you? And the reasons why I couldn't have any other pokes. He said, no, that's not a problem. That's not a problem. But I said, but he said, the poke jockeys will answer your questions. Imagine that. Just, Lord knows who, just handing out the pokes in in a stadium, they'll be able to answer my questions that, like I said, the College of Immunology and Allergy in America said, you should talk to your immunologist about. Because I had one up until I was a young adult, I guess you'd say, throughout my teen, from when I was a kid to my teens. I had an immunologist, more than one actually, but that's how bad my allergies were. They were shocked that I even survived my childhood. But arguably, this is what's funny. It might have been because I grew up on a farm. Like, that's what kept me alive, being around all of the stuff I was around. I raised quail and rabbit and, you name it. I grew up around dogs and cats and, there's an argument about being exposed to this stuff, right? Around the straw. And so throughout my youth, I was always stuffed up, always sick. And it wasn't just, I used to get these shots. This is why I understood the danger of having the same shot over and over again. How they used to treat my allergies back then. And I'm not alone in this. One of my best buddies used to get it too. They would make up these shots of a bunch of the stuff that you're allergic to, and they'd give you those shots every week. And it was designed to make you less sensitive over time, right? Because that's what an allergy is. It's an overreaction to something in the environment, right? Arguably, maybe some of them aren't overreactions, but, right, reactions that can cause physical harm, let's say that. Right? Because that's the problem, right? When you have a reactive body like mine, inflammatory, immune, and the allergies, it can kill you. I'm not exaggerating, right? Having that all at once can kill you. It's quite terrible to understand how the body can actually, in the name of trying to save it, can destroy itself. Kind of like what medicine's doing nowadays. Because recent podcasts, there's other doctors that are standing up about this. That maybe we're wrong about how we treat different diseases. Maybe we're wrong about our food supply. Maybe we're wrong about how we educate our kids. Maybe we're wrong about reading, and maybe we're wrong about so many things. But I've talked about this. What makes me different is I've never had that certainty that, oh, well, you're an expert in your field, or, your family. I've had nothing except for simply do the hard work, right? Everything I've done in my life, I never really realized this. And this is not like a humble brag. I suck at a lot of things, but everything in my life didn't come easy. I had to work towards, like, to be able to do things. Like, even when I was at the bank, I had to work really hard to just do what came naturally to most other people. But as I said, there was other areas that I excelled in, right? Relationship, communication. But this is what I'm getting at. What I've come to realize is I may have been right about Karl Marx as well. Because now that I've begun to heal out of this horrible disease, I have just, honestly, I couldn't do it on my own. It wasn't until modern science, a couple of doctors stood up and said, no, we're doing this wrong. Mast cell activation, histamine intolerance. We're doing all this wrong. We need to change this. Well, what I found out is, because of my allergies, maybe histamine sensitivity or mast cell issues, whatever it may be. You look at everything else, my specific disease, it's called hidradenitis suppurativa, or hidradenitis. I don't know how you want to pronounce it. I like to say hidradenitis suppurativa, right? It's so wonderful. But what ended up happening is, again, and this is what's funny, there's a podcast that doctors actually talking about this, what I've been saying for years, that we can't treat the mind separate from the body or separate from the soul, which many of these doctors aren't going to get. It's Gestalt health. We are a simplex, a complex, a synergy, a symbiosis. We are a biome. Not just a biome in our mouth or in our gut or in our butt, but our society, ourselves, and the interaction betwixt. I know, it sounds silly, it sounds ridiculous, but all these old ideas are new again. In fact, I pulled out a book that I've talked off and on about, like, how important it was and how ignored it was. It's that book by Hervé Fischer. I pulled it out again this morning because his lessons are still valuable. Right? I'll read the back. It says, Hervé Fischer believes that the digital revolution is a definitive moment in human history, as important as the discovery of fire. Important as the discovery of fire. See, that's my dyslexia, right? Because there's only one letter difference. You just mix them up, but you can see that, I don't read, I recognize words. So deceptively quiet, it is an invasion, radical, and affects all aspects of human activity. Fischer, one of the most important thinkers and writers on the philosophy and impact of the digital revolution, cautions that we need to develop a cyber philosophy that confronts this new reality. From cyberspace to artificial intelligence to genetic engineering, digital shock, the first English translation of Fischer's acclaimed Le choc du numérique, à l'aube d'une nouvelle civilisation, le trompe des cyberprimitifs. So the actual title would be The Digital Shock, I guess, The Dawn of a New Civilization. Could I translate it as that? And it says, The Mistake of the Cyber Primitives. And it goes on, it says, exposes the relationships between human beings and digital technology and examines our response to the myths and promises of the digital revolution. So what I got to tell you is this is 20 years old already and might even be more. Now, what's funny, as Jung said, that these ideas take 20 years to trickle down. So, 2006 is what it says. 2006. So 2006. So it's 20 years old because the original French let's think of the drama of The Gifted Child, 2 years before that. At least, before it went translation. I can't see it be much different, especially when it's, these academic stuff. It's not quick for translation. But what's funny is he doesn't talk about it much anymore. I don't know why. But he was right on so many fronts, but he's not out there talking about it. I'm currently rereading Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. Not for what you think. Believe it or not, I think he's wrong on a number of levels. But this is why we interact with this stuff, especially stuff that we find challenging. Because I think he'd be thankful in this if we find a way through that others haven't seen. Isn't that our goal? Right? So, I really was seriously depressed. I was walking this morning listening to The Anxious Generation and Jonathan Haidt. He was talking about how he's actually had 3 severe bouts of depression and medicated. And he actually gave the symptoms for, I can't remember exactly what he called it, but, depression. And it shocked me because, arguably we all will fall into that definition. Something that lasts longer than a week or a couple of weeks. Come on. Seriously. That's got to be the majority of us. Right? Let's look at it in a macrocosmic scale. So sure, you're not depressed for a full 2 weeks every week, but how many of us aren't paying attention to our actual emotional state? So what are the odds that if we actually zoomed out and looked, sure, it was only depressed for a week and then, you had a couple of good days and depressed again, or, you were depressed for a week and then, good for, a month and then depressed again. Isn't that just as bad? I know I digress, but here's what I'm getting at. Years ago, when I first started reading, this is probably 20 years ago, reading about studies related to psilocybin, psychedelics, mushrooms in particular. I remember there was this one guy. Usually the studies would show that there was long-term benefit from these medicinal psychedelics, even years after one dose. But what I found funny is an example they used was a gentleman who found the miracles of psilocybin, because he had some sort of horrible personality anger issue. That if he didn't lock himself in a room, and he didn't want to do it, but if he didn't lock himself in a room and take these medicinal mushrooms, and he just took like a powdered form in a little gel cap or whatever, and he'd swallow that down and he'd fight through the trip. But if he didn't do this, he said he was a horrible, horrible person. Horrible to everyone around him, horrible. But what shocked me is this was listed as a success story. But what they actually said is it made him better for a very short period of time. That's very similar to placebo, right? We've talked about gender transition. The gender euphoria only lasts a couple weeks. And after that, they go right back to their depression. So this gentleman here would see some relief, but would have to keep repeating this every few months. And yet nobody stopped and said, well, wait a minute, there's a disconnect here. We're simply treating the symptoms. And what's worse is it's not just an ignorance to the actual cause and the actual problems. It's a complete and utter blindness. I find, like I said, with my own doctor, I don't think he would even understand if I tried to explain some of this stuff to him. Right? Because I don't think he gets the plot. I said this before that I've talked to my doctor, and I said, well, why don't you tell people how important diet and lifestyle, yada, yada. I said, is it because people don't listen and you just, get tired of telling them? And he's like, yeah, okay. But don't you get tired of seeing them get sick and die? Like, I'm sorry. I guess even I fell for this. I was beginning to get demotivated. But I guess, as Nietzsche said, let yourself be the greatest creation. So if nothing else, I hope that this protocol can serve to heal future generations. Right? Because even Jonathan Haidt, I said this when I first listened to it, believe it or not, and here's how I've advanced. Listened to his audiobook, but I didn't used to go look at the PDFs. But this time I did. I went and looked at the PDFs, and more important, I looked at his errata, where he corrected some of his mistakes, and lo and behold, wrong. Wrong about some important things. Things that I even shared with other people. Ideas like locking up the phone when kids go to school is not actually going to benefit them. What I've always said is change the relationship with the phone. And I've said this to mothers as well. If a child changes his relationship with a phone, like me, when I was a banker, it was at a time when the iPhone and the BlackBerries had just come out. So really, the phone to me was not awesome. It was annoying as F. Right? Because it was constant harassment. I was even harassed on a moose hunt. And not even by other people. It was myself. I was harassed myself because of the disconnection. So I saw the danger of this always-on connection to a tool that turns us into the tool. So what I did was change my relationship with the phone. After I left the bank, I didn't put internet on my cell phones for years. At first, it was a little difficult and annoying, especially finding your way around places. But if you don't have what you want what you have. Right? So I was able to find ways around it. Like I emailed myself SMS turn-by-turn directions. Right? Google had all sorts of cool stuff at the time. Right? I leveraged ideas for areas without cellular access, like I used to have to do when I grew up north, for an area where, cell phones everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Essentially, they're even picking up your cell phone to advertise to you. But that changed my relationship to the phone, right? Even when I wanted to begin using audiobooks, I had to find something to use to listen to these things. And really, the only option is a cell phone. So that is what I recommend parents to do, because I cured myself of this always on connection to the cell phone, but I hadn't changed my relationship with the cell phone. And once I developed the cell phone as a tool for my betterment, not for my denaturement, when I realized what I needed to do, when I realized what I needed to do was use the phone for the audiobooks, because the only other options were tablets, which, like I said, much bigger, but not big enough for me to use for reading. So there was no sense. Much cheaper to just get a cheap, unlocked cell phone. And so I did. And there's the relationship change, right? If these kids were to start using their cell phone for something other than distraction or I hesitate saying entertainment. But so the biggest thing I want to point out is the biggest affirmation of staying confident, staying faithful, keeping trust in your path, even when all those around you doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. I said this early on. The greatest forecasters of what may come in the future, the greatest oracles of humankind, are the ones that doubt their own belief, their own ideas, and come to understand that doubt can guide us. In fact, I argue doubt is the first step towards guidance. Because until you open up and admit, as Confucius said, that the difference between knowledge and wisdom is knowledge is simply to know something, whereas wisdom is knowing how much there is to know and how little of it you know and will ever come to know. It's the Dunning-Kruger that I would like to point out to people, that the greatest risk for us are not these newbies who think they're experts, but it's the experts that think they're flawless. Everybody should come back and revisit what they hold to be true. And if, as Jung said, what I held to be error guides me better than what I held to be true, then I'll be guided by the error. Right? So I'm going to do the same thing. Whenever I have this doubt of my path, I'm going to make allowance for the doubting. I'm going to make sure that I'm not making a mistake. But if I've done everything I can to vet the doubt and verify my confidence in my path, well, then I'm going to proceed. Not without the doubt, but through. Do you follow me? So many of us, as Dante asked, how do we get out of this hell of ours? Virgil said, your way out is through. And this is where we're at. As they say, our psychology predisposes to us to this, that I was questioning whether I was on the right path. But all it took was, well, honestly, one podcast that spoke about something I've said many times. A professor telling his students that what we teach you here, 50% is wrong. But the problem is, we don't know which half. And until we realize, as I've said a million times before, we're not talking about the cult of science. What I'm talking about is Wissenschaft, the German word that takes us back to scientio, and I think the Latin. This idea of trying to come to understand something. And as I said, when only 9% of our doctors are staying up to date, is it any wonder that we're blind? I've said this a million times. If you go to post-secondary, the information they're going to teach you, again, half of it might be wrong, but more importantly, the information they teach you is likely 20 to 40 years old. And so your job is to learn how to think and then question what you hold to be true throughout your life. So on that, I thank you very much. Have a great day.